Often animating the anchor point is preferable to animating the position value, partly because you can get an overview of the anchor point path in the layer panel, makes it easier to select areas by double-clicking the layer and opening the layer panel. I can move the anchor point around to select different areas of my image. Now, if you want to follow along, you can open up Anchor Point Animation, AEP, and you can find that in the Fine-Tuning Animation folder. So as I said, one benefit is you can open up the layer panel and decide what you want to focus on just by dragging the anchor point onto the area you want to focus on. That's great. But how do we then actually animate this? Well, we animate it by, first of all, keyframing the anchor point property. So we're going to set a keyframe for anchor point. I'm going to remove the scale animation, and I do that by clicking on the stopwatch. If you have an animated property and you click on the stopwatch, that will stop animating that property and remove all the keyframes for that property. Now at the moment we're up to 205%. I'm going to back down to 100%. Okay, and we're going to move the anchor point just up a little bit. So we have all of these characters in the frame at that point. So that's going to be the beginning of the shot. And you'll notice by moving the anchor point in here, I decide what's going to be central to the shot. If I drag the anchor point onto his face, for example, that now becomes the center of that shot, his face. But we're going to have the center of the shot just above there, so that we also have this character in the frame. Okay, so to animate it, as I said, I set a keyframe, and then I'm going to move to the end. And all I need to do is just drag my anchor point over to where I want it to finish, which is on this crowd scene here. And the keyframe is automatically generated. And of course, After Effects does our tweening, works out all the steps in between. Now in the layer panel, I can see the path that's been created. And at the moment, it's a straight path. But I might want it to go past all of these people's faces. So maybe giving it a slight curve would achieve that. Now it's moving footage, so I can't be guaranteed that they will be in the same position throughout the whole shot. So I really do need to keep scrubbing through and just checking that everything's in the right position. I think that's a little high, so I'm going to drag it up a little bit and just put a slight curve in there. Now at this point, you'll notice that the main character here gets his head cut off. I could continue adjusting the curves to try and get him in the shot, but if I get him in the shot, I'm going to lose them out of later frames. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to pull the handle back down, and what I'm going to do is create another keyframe. Now, as well as dragging the anchor point here to create a keyframe, what I can also do is just scrub the values down in the timeline. So I can use now the composition panel as reference and scrub the values until I have them more central to my shot. And that creates a new keyframe. Okay. Now that can be problematic. It can stop the playback being as smooth by having an extra keyframe in there, but we're going to learn ways of smoothing out the timing of keyframes a little bit later, so I'm not going to worry too much about that. All I'm going to think about is whether or not I have people's faces central enough to my shot. Now at this point, I'd like them to be a little bit more central, so I'm just going to drag that down a little bit so that we have more of a curve in there. And I'm just going to preview it. Now you'll notice, because that was my active window, when I hit RAM Preview, it started previewing that window. Now if you always want to preview in the composition panel, what you can do is click on this button here, and that will say always preview this view. So now when I hit RAM Preview, it's always going to preview in the composition panel. Okay, if you want to see how the RAM Preview looks in the layer panel, you can deselect that and select the same button in the layer panel, preview it, and that way you can see how it looks without any of the effects applied. Now, if I want to see how it looks with maybe one effect applied, so maybe with my warp stabilizer, so once I've adjusted my anchor point path, I might want to see how it looks like reframed by the warp stabilizer. You'll notice that gives it a slightly different framing. So I may need to just check my output, make sure it still works. Okay, so I check it in the layer panel. If I'm happy with that, I check it in the composition panel. Now it has reframed it. You'll notice that at the beginning, we get slightly cut off. Okay, so at the beginning here, this character is just slightly getting cut off. So all I'm going to do is just make an adjustment to the anchor point setting just to bring him into frame a little bit more. And of course that's going to update immediately. Okay, so from a very wide shot of a crowd, we've created a much more intimate shot of the individual characters reacting individually to whatever the good news is that they've just heard. And you'll get a much smoother result animating anchor point and scale than you will animating position and scale. Quite often you'll find with position and scale, you get a kind of rippling effect when you try and animate the two properties together. I'm not sure of the exact technical reason for that, but I always figure it's something to do with the pixels being a bit confused about where they should move. If the scale's moving a pixel to the left and the position's moving towards the right, there's going to be a conflict there. And somehow animating the anchor point helps alleviate those problems. I always liken it to moving a camera, a rostrum camera, above an image rather than moving an image underneath the camera. Obviously, it's much easier to control and move the camera than it is the image underneath it. So that's a few tips about working in the layer panel and animating the anchor point value.